What's that, Sven? What? What do you mean? You mean we're live? What? Oh, what? You mean the camera's on? And there's people looking at us? Oh. Oh, hi. Hi, everyone. I'm here with Sven Skeleton. Mr. Pickles is chilling in his lap. What was that? Oh, he says everybody wants to hear a story or something. Oh yeah? Should take a drink? Okay. See if I can conjure up a story. What's that? Mr. Pickles what? Mr. Pickles is tickling your funny bone? That's ridiculous. I guess no one else speaks skeleton, so you guys can't actually hear what Bone Bag is saying to me. So everybody have a little drink, a little snack, maybe some spooky popcorn. Hang out with me, Sven Skeleton, Mr. Pickles, whole gang's here. Yeah, Sven's having a night, I think. He's getting a little impatient. He wants me to start the story. Okay. Calm your little bones. I'll get to it. We're gonna set the atmosphere. Okay? Just anyway. I am going to take you all on an adventure. But what I will probably do is split this up and do a little bit tonight, then do something a little different next week, and then maybe come back to this in 2 or 3 weeks, just so you guys can have a little mental break, because it is a lot. The story has a lot of very difficult themes in it, so I'm just warning everyone right now. I think I am going to kind of skip over some of the parts that are a little more descriptive just to prevent that as much as I can. And if you guys have any notion of where you think things are going, I would love to hear that as well. The title of this one is The Monster Under the Bed. All right, let's get into it. A labyrinth of cobalt and indigo. The hottest part of the flame burns blue, you know. Lost in 2 myriad oceans, 2 blazing skies, endless and flickering sparkles, those would be your eyes. Proximity brings a mournful joy. The closeness tempts the weak to destroy. Chapter 1, Journeys and Discoveries. Sitting in the drizzling rain, wondering if my big black boots were getting ruined, I had a flashback. There was a time that I could not exactly put my finger on, but a vividly unsettling, once-forgotten memory was dancing across the tips of my nerves. I scarcely noticed the wind whipping my wet hair across my damp face, or the realization that the approaching bus was late. In that moment, there was only a recollection quite suddenly of some horror that I had to have dreamed. Within that horror and curious event, I could not insert into a timeline. There was a man who was not a man. His smell, perhaps, more than any other thing I briefly recalled, is what jarred me back into reality. It was as if my brain could not allow me to fully remember. The weather was a bit damper than I had prepared for. I pulled my hoodie over my head, an action that now seemed a little ridiculous since my hair was already soaked through. Why are you like this? I tried to shake it off, but I felt stupid and somewhat helpless, even attempting to function like a regular person sometimes. One long drenched strand of golden red hair refused to stay put underneath the hoodie, so I relented and let it dangle. I wondered if my makeup was a mess as well. Realizing it probably was, I decided it didn't matter. It's not as if I was going to meet anyone of any importance, so my appearance was not really a concern. My appearance, what even was my style? I wear black pretty much all the time. A thing which had annoyed my parents growing up, but I suppose I never grew out of. Here I sit, big black boots, a black hoodie with a skeletal design, shiny black leggings, and a long black tunic. Fitting in perfectly with absolutely no one, and being completely at peace with that concept. Out of nowhere, the announcement rattled over the speakers.
Number 14 eastbound now loading for departure. Please have your tickets ready for the attendant, and thank you for traveling with us. Have a pleasant journey.
I teetered somewhere between queasy and elated as I stepped onto the number 14, my legs wobbly as I took a seat. My mind was rattled but muted thanks to the steady supply of pharmaceuticals dampening the noise in my head. I've been on at least 4 varieties of anti-anxiety medication and sleeping pills since my teenage years. I somewhat settled into the seat, a little absent-minded as I stared out the graffiti-covered window to watch the blur of movement. It was impossible, trying to go back to the thing I had recalled only moments ago, now seemingly absorbed into the chaos of things going by, heavily assisted by the medicinal cloud across my consciousness. I was heading to the house I grew up in, a place I had not returned to for over a decade. The trip was going to take me 3 days, and this was only the bus to the train station. But here I was. My journey had barely begun, and my stomach was naturally already in knots. I'm not a relaxed person in any situation. That should be obvious from the pills I'm taking, but this was worse. This was a special cocktail of shitty circumstances. It was not just the things I had tried for so long to forget twisting me inside and out, but the fact that I was going back to clean out my parents' belongings after their recent and mysterious passing. Oh, I suppose we hadn't covered that, had we? I can't keep up with my own thoughts, never mind this conversation. This is a conversation, isn't it? I digress often, so I do hope you will bear with me as I unravel this tale. Where was I? Oh, my parents' passing. Right. When I got the phone call, I'd been out of my mind on booze and pills, so the details of the conversation were rather blurry. I had a vague memory of an unknown something, bits and pieces of what I'd been told weaved in and out of focus. But my interest was on the music in the room, and more so, the man in my bed, not the aluminum voice feigning sympathy through my cell phone as they went over short details about what had happened. It all seemed like a very uneven dream at the time. The reality of it hit me like a ton of bricks the next morning, without too many details other than they were gone. No matter, though, even without knowing all of the details of what had occurred there, it was going to be a long 2.5 weeks in a very large and empty house alone. The bus arrived at the train terminal, and I had to go through the process of gathering my 2 small bags and getting on board. I never liked things like this, tedium of processes. All around me, countless people went about this business as though it were a common occurrence, almost a comfortable afterthought, when to me, the entire thing held a devilish sort of anxiety that wrenched my guts and made the palms of my hands perspire. I merely wanted to get this over with. I quickly double-checked the prescriptions in my purse and dug out a quarter Xanax. Swallowed it, creating enough spit to choke it down. I had never done well in crowds or on public transportation. I silently begged the pill to work quickly. As I ambled my way into the car with 3 other passengers, I took an account of each of them in silence, thankful that all present seemed agreeable to not exchanging the usual small talk or greetings. There was a young couple with that look in their eyes as though they might devour one another. The couple paid no attention to anything but themselves, and I was hopeful they would remain that way for the entire trip. My concern, if I had any, was with the older man that also joined us in the car. He was also a lone traveler. I hoped I would not have to attempt to appear like all those others that enjoyed this kind of thing and have to go along with some polite conversation. My brief summation seemed to confirm that would not be a concern, but I had my reservations all the same, as my general opinion remains that people get chatty when they become bored with their own thoughts, leading to blabbering on about grandkids, trips to national parks, and hip replacements. I've never known how to deal with those kinds of things, always feeling so removed from the normal chatter that seemed to never end. Weather, kids, work, the car payment, the mortgage, what so-and-so had for breakfast, or who had what illness at what time. It seems people do an awful lot of talking without ever really saying anything, as if the thought of silence hanging in the air is an offense that must be dealt with by moving lips and making noise. Constant, incessant noise. It made my head hurt. For now, silence and inner thoughts remained the way of things, and I was holding on to that as long as possible. Perhaps the Xanax I had taken would grant me a peaceful, albeit temporary, release from the surmounting anxiety that was welling up in every pore. I could just hope. As I chose my seat and tucked a bag in the cargo hatch above it, I began creating identities for my cabin mates. The young couple, he in ripped designer jeans and a pink mohawk, she in second skin leggings festooned with images of lips and eyes with her angled multicolor hair and 2 blue eyeshadow. I dubbed them Ken and Barbie because it made some weird part of me giggle. Ken and Barbie were quick to proceed with the task of slowly consuming one another, while the silver-haired man settled himself next to me. The seat was large enough for me to put one of my smaller bags in between us without it touching either of us, and so I did, finding comfort in the distance. I decided to dub him Arthur, maybe for King Arthur because he had a noble nose and a high, proud forehead. Arthur glanced briefly at me, then buried his face in his newspaper and seemed to forget I existed. I was okay with that. After a few announcements and the ringing of a loud bell, the journey began. Between the repetitive hum of the engine and the tracks below and the creeping effect of the pill in my system, I began to drift in and out on a wave of drowsiness. My mind just quiet enough for me to relax most of my muscles. My eyes started to lazily shut, and I knew I would not be awake for much longer. At some uncertain time after we set off, my head slumped forward, sending me into that sudden and disconcerting feeling of shock from coming out of a sleep that was too deep to have even bothered to warn of its approach. I had to assess the surroundings to make sure I was where I was and who I was. A quick mental checklist put me back at ease, though I realized I was dripping with sweat. How odd, that little voice inside said. I choked down another pill, feeling edgy and lost again, not wanting to lose it. I tricked myself into relaxing until the lull once again claimed me. There were miles of silence in that car. Arthur quietly read books. Ken and Barbie slept or ate one another's faces. There was no small talk. I had no idea how much longer the journey would be, but the stress beneath the surface was becoming steadily more uncomfortable. Every time I woke, I got that sinking feeling that the world was spinning and had to do math in my head for my dosage. I lost track of how many pills I had taken. Had I started out with a full bar of Xanax? I couldn't remember, so I would just take more. I wanted to get where I was going, take care of what I needed to do, and get back to my life. Left to reflect on that thought for a pause much too long, it rang true that it was a lonely life where the friends I had were all busy being married or having that one great romance that only ever seems to happen on film. Meanwhile, I had a revolving door of bad relationships and terrible decisions to think of. Even though I had managed to become a successful writer, I could never stay enthralled with one man. A problem I had endured since I had first blossomed into womanhood, something I never really could figure out. I liked them all well enough, just something was always missing. No matter how beautiful, intelligent, talented, or interesting they were, no matter how good of a lover, a mate, or a friend, I was never satisfied. It was sort of a joke in my family. I had no way of knowing that I was about to find out why I had never been fulfilled by love. Life is filled with these little riddles, isn't it? We're led into a thing of some gravity, scarcely aware of the ever-bursting molecules of inevitability going off like fireworks, when suddenly we find ourselves in the midst of explosions. It begs the question that if I had known, I wonder if I would have been afraid. I wonder if I would have turned back, grabbed the first normal, decent man I could find, and never let go of him. I somehow doubt it, but I wonder all the same. Then it occurred to me I'd already tried that without success. Would knowing really have made that any different? The train slowed and I realized that we were pulling into a station. I had to check 4 times to make sure that I wasn't at my stop. So easy to lose track of time in that car, falling in and out of sleep and staring out the window, seeing shapes in the shadows, some of which seemed eerily familiar. The haze of chemicals in my system intended to keep me calm and functional enough to manage this trip, perhaps serving a secondary purpose of allowing my mind to be just liquid enough to see things that people with clear, right minds never get a glimpse of. I never really believed I was one of those right-minded people, something that I was often envious of, being normal, finding the man to marry, and the perfect balance of living and working, creating and living. It always lingered just out of my reach. I could only create the love I wanted in my stories, but I could not possess it in my reality. Ken and Barbie, in their own way, represented an ideal of the perfect couple. The pretense of the things which I suppose I secretly envied exited at that stop, leaving me alone with Arthur. No one else ever came into our car, as if there was some sort of invisible sign posted alerting those that might dare to join us that it was not advisable. The panic welled and I popped another pill. Too late to change the action, I realized I had stopped counting them. It was around midnight when Arthur turned to me in a gentle voice which hinted at lineage not of this country and asked me if I was okay. A question that is so oddly intimate and strange, yet we ask others without much thought and without hesitation. That's what came to mind, even though my head was reeling and I was covered in sweat again. When I didn't speak, he handed me a bottle of water. As the glass hit my hand, I realized it was the good stuff, not the stuff in the cheap plastic bottles. I was grateful and accepted it. He didn't harass me, and I felt bad for being afraid of him. This is another thing that I just do. Tend to be wary of the good, harmless, even helpful people. Always drawn to those that would inflict harm, betray trust, use me for their own ends. Every time I realize that I do this, I pray for a lobotomy, so that I will cease to continue to do something that is illogical and potentially life-threatening. To my knowledge, no lobotomy has been granted as I find myself still doing this, but I can hope I'll learn eventually. There was a vague flash of him taking the bottle back and putting a Band-Aid on it as if to seal the lid. I thought it was a curious gesture, but I fell asleep again before reaching any conclusions about the act. At what I knew to be 6:10 a.m. from the glaring red lights above my head, we rolled into the station and the announcement came over the speakers. This was my stop, so I gathered all my things and found my way out of the train, and onto the platform. I had to find a cab, but I was having a hard time focusing on these tasks and did them in a weird automaton trance, a series of actions I did not feel or connect to. My skin so far removed and alien, though I knew it was my own. I tried not to run into people as I moved in an unnatural, almost robotic way. I failed and was spun around the wrong way in a violent whirl of plaid and wool. It was Arthur who caught me as I toppled backward, losing my balance. He put a gentle yet strong arm around me, the way a man might do if he had done it 1,000,000 times. He found a spot to sit me down and again gave me a bottle of water, which curiously had a Band-Aid on it. It didn't occur to me to ask why. I just peeled it off the lid so I could drink. He asked where I was heading. I mumbled something that sounded like the address, but I really wasn't sure. My mouth was not cooperating. After a few moments of my mouth failing me and Arthur straining to understand, he handed me a slip of paper and a pen. The only word that found its way to my ears with any clarity was address. I wrote quickly and pressed the piece of paper back in his hand. It was seconds before he had me on my feet and out to the roadway, where this helpful man that I had judged so harshly hailed a cab for me. I tried to thank him, but there was a high-pitched whining in my ears that made it hard to know if the words ever came out. Arthur set me up in the cab and handed me a card with his telephone number on it, suggesting that I contact him when I arrive at my destination so he wouldn't need to worry. A gesture too kind for me to acknowledge with any kind of grace, so I simply and dumbly nodded. He handed the cab driver a bill, told him the address, and shut the door. The cab ride was mostly insignificant, though I did manage to pull myself somewhat back together. Just being away from the chaos of people at the station was enough to stabilize me, which made all the sense in the world. I began to regain control of my limbs and no longer felt like a robot. As we pulled onto the road where the house of my youth was waiting for me like a blind date, another of those vivid memories rushed over me like an eager lover, unable to wait for the right moment. I was swept up in a brief yet intensely sharp memory of playing in the garden as a girl, where I had caught a glimpse of something in the peripheral that sent the hair on the back of my neck on fire. It was gone as quickly as it had come. I slumped against the seat, damp and panting. The driver's eyes met mine in the rearview mirror for a second, and I swear he grinned. I shifted in the seat to be out of his view, content to stare out the window and ignore him. As we pulled up to the old house, my skin zapped into life. I felt electric and somewhat sick to be back here. The house looked the same as I remembered. Oak trees lined the walkway as though they were trapped in time. Well-trimmed bushes still guarded the front porch, tucking it slightly out of view. The house had been repainted a kind of tan color, but that was the only difference. There were still the same gingham curtains and the slightly out-of-place bright red door. There were memories and many secrets which would unravel themselves in time. Hiding behind that big red door, a mouth to hell that I could not remember. I opened the big red door slowly. The house whispered a greeting as the light sliced the entry in half. How odd to be here like this, knowing that no one was coming to hug me, even though it had been a long time since there was any of that. I sat my bags on the bench inside the entryway and moved into the house as if I was not supposed to make noise, like a trespasser. This is nothing new. It's something I have always done no matter where I am, even in my apartment back in the city. Like I belong nowhere, and disturbing so much as dust is an offense. I have no indication as to why I am this way. I walked through the house on careful feet, assessing my landscape. All familiar, all removed, and nearly nauseating. This house that looked so innocent from the street had never been a happy place. But I didn't know just how unhappy it had truly been. Not yet. That was going to become very clear in a matter of time. I mostly remembered fights about the way I dressed and the lifestyle I'd chosen. That was the only context I had as to why the memories this house carried were so bad. I didn't want to touch anything, so I didn't for a long time. Instead, I went back out of the big red door, that strangely gaping mouth with all the words it couldn't say, and sat on the porch swing. I reached in my backpack and produced a bottle of vodka and took a long gulp. If I was going to be here and endure this terrible emptiness, I refused to do it sober. After drinking a fair amount to the point that all the lines of everything were fuzzy, I ultimately went back inside. I spent the afternoon packing boxes for donating from the kitchen. When that was completed, I emptied a filing cabinet next to the desk in the living room, since I hadn't dared to venture further into the house. There was a sadness in the house that went beyond the lingering vacancy of the people that no longer lived. In the house, or at all, now. The quiet and the smells all filled my head. Perhaps the liquor clouded my judgment, disfigured reality, dulled the edges of consciousness. None of that mattered to me, not really, but there was a sort of presence in the stillness. I turned up the old stereo in an attempt to drown out the silence and all the whispers dancing within it. The pile of papers in front of me on the floor, sprawled out like a crime scene, barely held my attention. Something distracting was tickling my senses and causing me to want nothing more than to sleep. But it was too early and I was restless. I forced my attention back to the pile of papers, deciding that not doing anything at all was not actually an option, unless I wanted to remain in this lonely house forever. That thought alone was enough to motivate some kind of action from me. Papers, just do the papers, clean that little mess up, one thing at a time, one tiny step at a time, just get this done. I worked tirelessly at the papers and was able to focus, finally, at just that one task enough to complete it. There was nothing too interesting in that work, and the level of things in my system had dulled my hairline senses enough to where I didn't even notice that something in the room was shifting around me. Something there with me. Something not leaving my side. I couldn't feel it at all. I blacked out around 5 a.m., my head on a box that I had managed to completely fill up to be sent to the shredder. Day 1. When I woke up, it took me a few minutes to remember where I was. I took off my boots and stretched out my toes, pulling off my dirty socks and cracking my feet with my hands. I stretched and cracked my neck a few times before pushing the box to the side against the wall. I pulled my cell phone out of the bag where I hadn't remembered placing it and woke it up. The angry light displaying the time forced me to squint, even though the room wasn't completely dark. Something about the numbers on the cell phone was just too harsh. Okay, it's 2 p.m. here. Wow, my schedule is going to be a mess by the time I head back home. Ugh! Out loud, to no one. I frequently talk to myself, so the fact that I'm doing a lot of this now isn't really that weird. The thing that is different about it is that it feels like I have an audience. That is unsettling me. Maybe enough to bring on a little anxiety. Better take a little something for that before it gets out of hand. I pulled the backpack around and reached in to grab my pill bottles. As soon as I'd fished out the lowest dose possible of Xanax, I swallowed it down with the only liquid I had nearby: vodka. It was not remotely enjoyable to consume upon waking, but it did the job. Eventually, I wandered into the kitchen, seeking some kind of nourishment. I found some whole grain bread and a ripe avocado. It seemed that avocado toast was on the menu. I'd need to find some coffee, too. I dug through the cupboard and found some instant crap. After breakfast at the completely reasonable hour of 3 p.m., I spent an absurd amount of time cleaning the kitchen. It wasn't really dirty. I just didn't want to go deeper into the house yet. I wasn't sure why, but something about being here now was giving me the creeps. Since I couldn't really put my finger on what it was, I just ignored it and limited myself to the few rooms that I had already been in: the kitchen, downstairs bathroom, dining room, and living room. I'd spent the night on the floor in the living room on the box I'd packed, my boots still on my feet. Not the most restful night of sleep I had ever had, but certainly not the worst by far. I'd spent a good amount of nights sleeping in my clothes after a hard night of partying to not really be particularly fazed by sleeping on the floor with my head on a box. Still, a shower needed to happen because honestly I was starting to stink. The problem with this fact being that the downstairs bathroom is only a half bath. I would have to make my way up the stairs. I decided that I was going to have to just suck it up, get over whatever was making me feel uneasy, and just deal with it in whatever way I could to make progress. I knew a shower would not only help me smell better, but would also make me feel a lot better. There's this weird thing with showering when where you are dry. The thought of getting in the shower sounds terrible, but once you're in there, the dry world sounds terrible, and you wondered why you were putting off taking a shower to begin with. After you shower, there's that sense of renewal that is undeniable. A shower has always made me feel better. With some kind of newfound steely reserve, I decided to try to do this without any more pills. I needed to remain conscious, and it was only a slight discomfort lingering now. I concluded that it had to be just because I hadn't been here in so long. That settled something in my brain which allowed me to pull myself together. I grabbed my backpack from the pile of luggage, which was in the middle of the living room, and flung it over my shoulder, stating to no one, "Yeah, going to need to move this into a bedroom at some point." I, and my invisible audience, dismissed my own guidance for the time, though, focusing on the need for a shower above all else. I ambled my way on bare feet up the wooden staircase to the second floor, my backpack flopping carelessly over one arm. A faint layer of dust had only just started to gather on the surfaces, and the house smelled mostly clean. If something awful had happened in this house, there was no sign of it now. It looked mostly like a showroom house, and not so much like a house that had recently been the site of some kind of abduction, from what I somehow recalled from that phone call. Their bodies were found in the woods. But when investigators arrived at the house, they only found that big red door wide open. No apparent sign of struggle was anywhere to be found. No blood, no prints, no weapon, no sign of forced entry. Nothing, just bodies in the woods, dehydrated and completely empty of blood. I hadn't pressed the person on the other end of that call to explain how the blood had been drained from my parents' bodies. Once again, I had been preoccupied, so the details were quite fuzzy. I had written down the name of the lead investigator and a phone number somewhere in my notepad. I believe they needed me to come to the station to go over some things, but wow, that was a lost detail. Did we have an appointment scheduled that I had forgotten about? Possibly. I'd have to check my notepad. But for now, I just needed to shower and try to feel somewhat human. I padded into the bathroom, assessing my surroundings as though I'd never seen this room in my entire life. Maybe I hadn't. I didn't remember this room looking this way. The tile was new. It looked like Mom got into some new craft project in the years I'd been gone. The tile was a mosaic pattern which made a star in the dead center of the bath, a big blue 5-point star perfectly placed in a sea of white. Interesting choice, Mom, I chuckled to myself. The tub itself was new as well, and not the old, outdated bathtub I'd remembered, but a brand new soaker tub fit for 2 people easily. There were some other updates too. As I looked around, I noticed a brand new basin had been installed while I'd been away. Actually, the entire bathroom had been updated. Something about that was comforting. It felt foreign, but for reasons I couldn't put my finger on at that moment, that was just the thing I needed to feel completely at ease. Gone were all of my previous reservations. Once the water was at the perfect temperature, I quite comfortably removed my clothes and stepped into the shower. I must have stayed in there for a good solid 40 minutes. It was absolutely the thing which I'd needed to do. I realized now as I sat on the edge of the tub wringing water from my hair. After I dried off, I found some cleanish clothes in my backpack. I slipped into a comfy pair of black leggings and a long, loose top. I would need to do laundry soon. Feeling renewed, I headed back downstairs and tried to clean up some of the mess I'd made with my luggage in the living room. I had a moment of complete peace, which for me was rare. So rare, in fact, to the point of it never happens. It was as if something had comforted me to a point I hadn't gotten on the pills. The chime of the doorbell forced me out of the moment. Did anyone know I was here? I approached the door slowly, stopping to peer out the peephole. Adam? I squeaked from behind the door as I opened it. He was still relatively handsome, dark black hair, chiseled features, eyes beaming, tan, healthy looking, and one of the only boys from high school that I ever really got along with, even though the romance never sparked. We were more like friends with occasional benefits. He was a decent lover and always got primo weed. I hoped he was here to get me high. That would be the best welcome home ever. He grabbed me before I could invite him inside.
Andy Candy.
He hugged me, simultaneously lifting me off my bare feet. I giggled as he put me back on my feet. I had no idea that anyone knew I was here. There is something to be said for caution. People do die around these parts. I recalled something else I hadn't thought of for some time. The unsolved murders of teenagers in the woods that were just a quarter mile down the street from here. 2 of which were guys I'd fooled around with, not knowing that I was some kind of dare, and the others were just random kids from the area, most of whom had tormented me in my youth. A violent shudder shot through me at the memory. As if he could read me, he held something in front of my face. I think this is what the doctor ordered. Not wanting to go back in the house just yet, I moved to the porch swing with Adam. We smoked the weed he'd shaken in front of my face just a few moments ago, and caught each other up on the most decadent events of the last decades. Things seemed almost normal. After a couple of hours, the sun had long set in the west. We moved from the porch and settled inside on the couch where we sat facing each other, laughing about old times and distant memories. Warning, warning, warning. Things are about to go very, very bad. I am going to probably skip over quite a bit of this because I just don't need to read it to you. Several hours and 2 bottles of wine later, I realized that I had nearly forgotten the dread of earlier and eased myself back onto the sofa. I relaxed and let out a deep sigh of relief. Adam must have picked up on a signal I hadn't realized I put out because he was kissing me hard before I had a chance to refuse. I pushed back on him, my small hands on his huge chest like a mouse hitting a mountain. He got the hint after a smack missed and hit him in the jaw. He pulled away by inches and looked down at me, his eyes rimmed in red, his lust obvious even through the state of his confusion. There was a heat in his glare and danger dancing on the corners of his mouth. What the hell, I thought, my will wearing down and my body responding to the kiss that still lingered in the wetness of my mouth. And then some things happen. You can use your imagination. So some things happen, but our dude here is not nice. Yeah, it's not a good time. She's not having fun. So she ends up face down in the carpet. I'll just skip to that. After a few moments of lying there, face to rug, catching my breath and feeling the aching from where he'd violated me, I shot him a caustic glance and with an air of defiance lifted myself to his face and took the pot from him mid-inhale. "Hey," he complained, pinching my arm. I slapped him with my free hand across his thigh, inches from his sagging manhood. I took a long drag as I lounged back against the sofa. He took the pot back from me and smiled coyly like a boy on a date. I wasn't amused. Before I really knew I was doing it, I ran a hand into his hair, coiling my fingers through it and grabbing him hard. He looked excited for a second as I pulled him by the hair towards my face. I brought him right up to my lips, then abruptly shoved his face down into the rug. "Come on, Andy, cut the shit," he started to say, voice trailing off as I ground his mouth first, deeper into the rough and dusty fibers. I didn't know where this strength was coming from, or the rage. It was in that moment between his pleas and choked anger as I buried his face into the carpet I'd thrown up on as a small child that I felt a calm wash over me. It wasn't from the marijuana or the lingering effect of the pills or booze, not even the sensation of the lingering taste of sex. It was a detached thing, and within it, a presence lingered. There was a tremor upon the hand and Adam's hair where a shimmering blackness appeared only for an instant. My skin quaked with 1,000 volts of electricity as something unseen let go of my hand and touched my hair. Was it a growl I heard, warm against my ear, above which the hair was moved to expose it? Then it all stopped and Adam was free of my grip. He backed away without looking away from me. His lip was bleeding. I could not help the smile. The laughter erupted seconds later. This was not at all amusing to Adam. "Andy, I sliced through the laughter and shot him a silencing look. "I think you better leave." There was a movement in the room behind him, but nothing seemed to be there. I shrugged it off, but not the urgency to get him out of this house. I was pissed and sore, yes, but there was a dark energy rising in the room, and I grew fearful for this jackass. Something just felt wrong, and I had had enough for one day. He sat there slack-jawed for another moment, making no effort to collect himself. I leapt to my feet and grabbed his pants, tossed them at his face with all the force I had. "Get the fuck out of here!" My voice cracked. He just sat as though in a trance. I grabbed his arm and shook it urgently. When he still didn't move, I slapped him hard across the face, my rings sending blood splatters across the white flowers in the sofa fabric. He grabbed my wrist before I could back away. His fingers were strong, and my bones whimpered in agony as his grip increased. He twisted it around in his grip and then suddenly snapped it back. I didn't cry out. I screamed bloody murder as I felt the distinct crack of a bone going wrong. That's when it happened. The darkness behind Adam moved as though ink was being poured across the night sky. A shape that refused to show itself coiled into frame, and before I could distinguish a shape from a shadow, there was a rush of movement, faster than anything I'd ever seen. Then nothing. Adam was just gone. I stood for what seemed like hours in the vacancy where only seconds before there had been company. The bones in my wrists throbbing, my groin throbbing, the places where hands had been unkind, searing with pain. My face raw and rug-burned, my hair tangled, my mascara ruined. I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the French doors to the dining room. I was still naked. After collecting a fresh shirt and pair of yoga pants to slip on from my bags, I assessed my face in the bathroom mirror. I looked rough, but that was of no consequence right now. I had to call someone and find out what had happened to Adam. I sloppily wrapped my pounding wrist in an ace bandage and went for my cell phone, which was quickly running out of juice. I dialed Adam's cell, hoping it was the same number that he'd had all those years ago. An unfamiliar voice came over the wire, just a voicemail. I didn't wait for it to play, and I didn't leave a message. I just hung up, feeling defeated. I didn't really know anyone here anymore, and I've never liked cops. Besides, how exactly was I going to explain what happened here? Maybe I should just wait until morning. Maybe my mind played a trick on me. Maybe he just got fed up and got the hell out of here and he'd cool down and call or come by tomorrow and I'd know that everything was fine. Just too much alcohol and weed on top of the prescriptions. I told myself that I'd had such a severe hallucination due to all these things, and that could be the only logical explanation. My cell phone died at that moment. I dug through my bags and retrieved the charger, but my cell phone wouldn't power back on, just gave me the battery charging screen. My wrist was hurting too much to continue to mess with it. I fished some Valium from my pill bag. The only thing to do now was sleep. I'll deal with this tomorrow, I convinced myself, mentally patting myself on the back for being so calm. I choked down the bitter pill, both of my lack of conviction in the lies I spun to myself, and in the literal pill as it partially dissolved in the orange juice going down the back of my throat. Sleep was going to come like a thief, hard and chaotic, offering no solace for the conscious thought being stolen from me as I slipped into the ether of its realm. Sometime in that fitful slumber, I awoke, hazy, sweaty, all the edges of my landscape blurred, and for a moment I swore that I saw long fingers with claws, black and inky on my leg, caressing the bruises I'd earned in the previous evening's violence. There was no sound, and nothing to show it was an illusion or reality. My eyes too heavy to focus, my will too weak. I succumbed again to the blackness and nothingness, falling into the deepest cavern of unconsciousness. My eyes opened again to the sound of knocking, loud and impatient on that big red door. The gaping mouth that told no secrets but held them all inside. The door where I hadn't seen Adam leave through, as though he was now another secret that the door had sworn to silence. I threw on a sweater after I'd made sure to pull my pants back on and smooth out my hair. I had no idea what to expect when I pulled the handle and opened the door just enough to see her. She was tall, shiny blonde hair up in a tight ponytail, further accentuating the two perfect cheekbones. Her eyes were blue orbs in red pools, obviously from crying. I recognized her immediately and had to suppress the guilt that was threatening to expose me. It appeared that Adam made good on that engagement after all, if the giant rock on her shaking left hand was any indication. Odd that he'd made no mention of it, but thinking back on the night we'd had now, that wasn't all that shocking. I mustered up something akin to concern within the confusion, shock, and surprise that had no doubt flooded my face. Lucy, Whitestone, right? She painted on a smile, a single tear slipping into her parted lips. Actually, it's Mills. Adam and I... She trailed off. I wasn't sure how much of Adam's relationship with me that Lucy was aware of. I don't know if he had ever told her much, other than possibly that he and I were good friends who'd gone through some tough times together. I hoped I didn't smell like him. Oh, right. I seem to recall something about that. Not to be rude, but what are you doing here? Lucy was a polite girl that came from a family of influence, and it showed as she struggled with the next thing she said. Oh, my manners. Her hands were shaking as she held up a folded piece of paper. You see, it's just that I found this note this morning, Andrea. And well, is my husband here? There was saccharine in her voice as my full proper first name fell off her tongue. She shot me a glance, and I didn't miss it. I knew what the polite Mrs. Adam was inferring. I took the note as I told her that he wasn't, as I was not saying anything more until I could assess the full scope of what damage had already been done. The note was definitely Adam's. It just said, old friend in town, going to catch up, see you when you get back tomorrow, XOXO. Relief shot over me as I handed the note back to Lucy. Sorry, Lucy, Adam did drop by last night to bring me that stellar bottle of Merlot. I made a motion that I hoped appeared casual and further paused to gesture to the swing where, thankfully, only one wine-stained glass remained next to the bottle Adam had brought. I sent him on his way after a while, and then I finished it alone. To be honest, I drank myself stupid on it. I think he mentioned going to see another friend, maybe at Ernie's. It's pretty fuzzy, though. I'm sorry I'm not more help. I'm sure he's fine. You know Adam. Lucy's lips twisted into a pout. If she had any doubt in the truth of what I'd just said, it didn't show. Okay, well, Andy, if you hear from him, will you please call me? Only this time, don't hang up. The eel shot through my gut as I recalled the phone call I'd made to Adam's cell phone so late. My number must be in the caller ID. Of course, what a dumbass. I struggled for a second too long trying to come up with an explanation, but she beat me to it. Sounds like you were pretty wasted last night, so the call was probably just a drunk dial. It happens. Just same number, okay? That's when she saw the haphazard ace bandage on my wrist and the discoloration that was peering out from behind it. What happened there? The concern was genuine. I tried to brush it off. Oh, nothing really. I dropped a box on it while packing up stuff yesterday. I'm sure it's fine. Her eyes grew wide and her voice dropped. Oh my God, Andy. I am so sorry. I completely forgot. I was very sorry to hear about it. I didn't want to talk about it. It's okay. You have other things on your mind. Well, at least let me take a look at that wrist. Maybe you didn't hear, but I've been the head nurse at St. Elizabeth's for many years now, and I wouldn't feel right if I didn't check that out. I made a feeble attempt to protest, but she shot me a glance, gesturing her way past me into the hallway. Please, Andrea, if it's no big deal, I'll be on my way, but in good conscience, I have to take a peek. I relented. As she turned her back on me, I smelled myself anywhere I could in hopes I would find no trace of her husband's scent. As we moved into the dining room, I quickly surveyed the living room where only hours ago her husband had ravaged me in such a brutal, demeaning way that the recollection sent a shudder over me. I needed to make sure there wasn't a trace of any of it. Relief again swept over me as I confirmed there was nothing there. The blood-splattered sofa was nicely hidden beneath a pile of blankets that I'd had no memory of putting there, but I was more thankful for it than anything, as it assured me that there would be no uncomfortable questions that I would have to mask by more uncomfortable lies. She seemed to have regained a strong sense of herself as she told me to have a seat and washed her hands in the adjacent half-bath. I sat as instructed, and she emerged, her eyes less puffy, her face determined yet soft. She must be a favorite at the hospital. She took the arm that had begun to swell and bruise, being extra careful not to jostle it as she unwound the bandage that I had barely been able to tighten. As soon as the skin was revealed, she delicately turned my tiny arm over as she examined it. She monitored my face for reactions. When I gasped, she made a clicking noise with her tongue. I think we have a break here, or at the very least, a bad fracture. This is going to need x-rays and possibly a cast. Dropped a box on it, huh? The look she gave me told me she'd heard that before when some woman showed up with these kinds of bruises. I was desperate to imagine away the very clear marks of a hand that had done this. Yeah, that's right. I'm clumsy. She allowed the lie, sealing some pact between two women that had secrets for a reason, not wishing to unearth them. You should come in. I'll drive you. Your parents donated a lot to the hospital after the fire 2 years ago. We can just consider this prepaid. I didn't want to follow her, but I realized that if I didn't, it would make me look guilty. Hell, I admit, I was guilty, but so was Adam. It was him, after all, that had come to the house with wine and weed. I knew him well enough to figure out that this was probably not an isolated incident. Maybe Lucy wasn't stupid, and I should just accept the kindness of someone with all that was going on. Besides, my wrist was useless in its current state, and I had a house to go through and pack up. I begged her to allow me to change. I only succeeded in pulling on a different shirt and slipping on some old slippers. It was all I could manage, and I wasn't about to ask the wife of the man I'd just been with to dress me. I quickly sprayed myself with a strong body spray, determined that there had to be some trace of him that she would smell if I didn't. The ride to the hospital was calm and not as awkward as I had anticipated. Lucy was pleasant to be around. I found that I actually liked her, which made the events of the previous evening feel like they'd happened to a different person. In my own defense, I really didn't know. If I had known, I wouldn't have touched a married man. It never even crossed my mind to find out. I had no reason to feel guilty, but I did. I wanted to tell her, but how could I after I'd already lied? At the hospital, Lucy was careful to keep prying eyes away, which I appreciated. I had mentioned not wanting to have to answer a lot of questions about my parents' death. She understood. The x-rays confirmed a fracture, which meant a cast. I wasn't thrilled, but I was happy that I wasn't going to be in agony. A few hours and several doses of morphine later, I was dropped back at the house. Lucy invited me to dinner. I was too warm and fuzzy to refuse her. She said she'd be by around 8. I fell asleep on the sofa, still wearing my slippers. The sound of my cell phone chirping somewhere I couldn't immediately place jolted me out of sleep. My only purpose was shutting the noise off. I dug around the sofa and finally found it underneath the pile of blankets. As I fished it out and saw the caller ID flash, Adam Mills, I noticed the forgotten blood spatters. Now a deep shade of brown across the white fabric roses. A chill went through me as I answered the call. Lucy wasn't going to be able to keep our dinner date. I did my best not to show how relieved I was. She said we'd have to reschedule. The hospital needed her tonight. She asked me how long I was in town for again. We disconnected the call with tentative dinner plans for Saturday. It was only Wednesday, so that gave me some time to be more prepared. I hoped that Adam would return to her and that bait would be broken too. I shuddered as I had a brief thought of her just showing up here with him. I shook the thought away and decided to get up and make food. I didn't know when the last time I ate was. According to my phone, it was 5:56 p.m. I had been asleep for 4 hours. As soon as I put my phone down, the emptiness around me felt suffocating. I grabbed my bag from the chaise and rifled through it for a bottle of pills, feeling the anxiety creeping in and not wanting to go with it. Something poked me in the soft of my hand. I pulled it out and inspected what was a business card, linen embossed, the kind that cost a pretty penny to be made. On the rear side of it, a note scribbled in dark fluid penmanship. Please do not forget to call me. I will worry. The name wasn't instantly recognizable to me. Vladimir Lupai, spiritualist. I carried the card with me into the kitchen, running it between my fingers as I turned on the lights. It wasn't quite dark, but I just felt more at ease with more lights on. I ran some water into a cup and popped whatever was in my hand, not really remembering or caring what I'd grabbed. I opened the pantry to see if there was anything consumable left behind. I hadn't even thought to go into town and buy groceries. I was spoiled by the city and the offering of just about any type of cuisine one could imagine, delivered to your door, oftentimes well into the a.m. There had better be something palatable in this house, or I'd have to resort to pizza, the only thing deliverable in this godforsaken place. After finding only some noodles and no sauce, I dialed the pizza place from my cell. Halfway through the first ring, I hung up. It dawned on me that I hadn't bothered to check the landline. I mean, I was here to wrap up all these loose strings. It was entirely possible that the landline was still working. I grabbed the cordless from the counter and was surprised to hear the dial tone, though really, for all practical purposes, I should have expected that. I hit the speed dial for Slice-O-Life Pizza and placed my order. When I gave my name, the kid on the phone told me to hold on. A few moments passed before there was an older girl's voice on the line. Andy? My heart jumped in my throat. It was a voice I hadn't heard for over a decade. Mel? I choked out the word. Oh my God, Andy, please tell me you're okay. I'm as good as I can be, I guess. What are you doing here? She explained that unexpected events had changed her circumstances, and she'd been back here for about 7 years. She told me she was a different person for a few years after she came home, and that after she started to get herself back, she didn't know how to find me. She said she couldn't really talk now, but she wanted to come over and help me, and that tomorrow was her day off. She wouldn't let me refuse, threatening, I know where you are, I'll just show up. It was as if the clouds had parted. Even just knowing that I wasn't going to be in this morgue alone for a while filled me with a sense of calm, but seeing Mel again, well, that was icing that I never expected on the shit cake. I was lost in the happy moment when something crept up in the back of my neck as my eyes snapped shut. Adam, said a voice from behind my eyelids. Shit! I hadn't intended to say it out loud. Mel started to ask what was wrong, but was called away by one of the employees over some situation with a customer and couldn't finish the thought. I gotta run, Andy. Your food will be there soon. I'll see you tomorrow. I stood there looking dumb for a few moments, holding the receiver in my hand as the beep, 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 beep chime rang out into the empty room. I absently set the phone back on the base and walked on unsteady feet to the living room, to the sofa. I pulled the blankets back and forced myself to look at the stains. All that I had told myself earlier started to nag at me, that he'd just freaked out, needed to walk away and blow off some steam, that he'd show up, a little worn and deflated, but whole and real. I ran the blurry memory over and over again, trying to see what my eyes had perhaps gotten wrong. Inkiness spilled over the memory, and the images drowned in blackness. The doorbell snapped me out of a trance. I darted to the kitchen and grabbed a 20, nearly slamming into the front door as I answered it. My stomach growled at the familiar smell of garlic wafting up through the cardboard. I was hungrier than I'd realized. After destroying about a third of the huge pie, I dug through the liquor cabinet and produced a nice-looking bottle of red wine. I looked around after pouring myself a glass, walking through the house, flipping more lights on. There were maybe 4 boxes packed and labeled, shoved against a wall in the dining room. I still had so much to do, and I'd accomplished basically nothing. I sat the glass down on the desk, an old, genuine antique secretary style carved from fine cherry wood, not one of those modern steel and glass contraptions. It smelled amazing. I rolled up the front cover, careful not to knock my glass over. This seemed a good place to start. Lots of bills to go through and sort, detail work that I hoped would keep me occupied, and inane enough to prevent the looming freakout continuing to threaten an appearance. I lost myself in the task at hand of looking through stacks of numbers, making notes on a calendar of which utility needed shut off when and how much was owed. I looked through banking statements and ledgers, uncovering aspects of my parents' finances that surprised me. The most surprising being an account from a Swiss bank. This was the first time I'd ever heard of this. My parents weren't poor, but as far as anyone knew, they lived a modest life. There were no extravagant purchases, no brand new cars, no high-end appliances. Hell, they didn't even own a computer. I would need to dig out my laptop and hope my phone would be enough to get me a signal. The only way I was going to make sense of the new information about the secret account was going to be with the meeting scheduled for Monday. I'd have to deal with it then. I gathered all the documents I could find related to the overseas bank account and put them to the side, then continued to rifle through the regular bills and the bank account they'd had for at least 20 years. I hoped the savings would be enough to cover their funeral expenses. As I sat going through years of receipts and random paperwork, I absently reached in my bag and grabbed my pills. I wasn't keen on the notion that night was rapidly falling around me and noises in the house, regardless if the work of settling pipes or scrounging rodents, or making my skin crawl. I thought again of Adam. I pushed the thought back down to someplace I didn't have to feel it, and swallowed whatever I had in my hand. I was being careless, and I realized too late. I pulled both prescription bottles from my bag and tried to remember what I'd just swallowed. I gave up quickly, relenting to whatever fate I'd already handed myself for the night. After boxing up all the stuff to send to the shredder, I looked around the room, feeling overwhelmed by the amount of stuff still untouched. I'd nearly forgotten about the wrist, the cast, my nearly useless arm. Medication has this way of making me forget my own limitations, usually well until it's too late and I'm working through strained muscles or bleeding fingers. This time, my wrist gave me a sharp reminder that it was still not okay. Great! More pills! Out loud, to no one. I went to the sofa and spied the familiar white of a pharmacy bag, tag still stapled to the outside. Hydrocodone. Take one every 4 hours as needed for pain. Perfect. Again, to no one. I just might die here tonight, ladies and germs. I bowed to my non-existent audience. As I smirked to myself and ripped the bag open, I heard the faintest scratch, scratch, scratch noise nearby. I thought I caught something shimmer through the darkness in the places the light couldn't reach. My skin went cold. Goose flesh covered my arms. I strained against my sanity to see what I imagined I saw, the large, spiky outline of something darker than the shadows, lurking in the hallway, staring at me. I could feel it, like static electricity. All my hairs were on end, and the world was humming. Hello? My voice arced back to my ears, sounding small and stupid. I shifted from the sofa, turning to face the hallway head on. I know you're there. I don't know how I know, but I took cautious steps forward towards the blackness. I was in the middle of the room, staring into the abyss. Who was I talking to? Well, this is stupid. I lunged backward a step and tossed the pills in their bag onto the sofa. The hydrocodone in my hand, I chased that down with the last of my third glass of wine. I moved to the stereo and put a record on. That was one thing that was great here, vinyl. The hiss and crackle of the needle filled the stillness as the opening chords of White Rabbit blared into life around me. I danced into the dining room again, pouring the last of the wine, belting along with Grace Slick. I couldn't prove it to myself, but I knew someone was still watching me. As much as I fought to keep that thought down, as much as I reminded myself that I wasn't normal, it didn't go away. That was the last thing I remembered. And that is where we're going to end. Tune in next week. What? What's fun? But I'm not repeating it. That's going to be on him. Anyway, everyone, that has been first chapter of The Monster Under the Bed. Anyway, I'd love to hear what everyone thinks and what your theories are, what you think is happening. I'd love to hear that. So just drop some comments and let me know what you all thought, or that's what we're doing. So we're gonna say goodbye. Sven would like to say goodbye to everyone. He wishes everyone a good night. Mr. Pickles, I don't know if you can see Mr. Pickles. Let me see if I can scoot over here. Hi, everybody. Okay.
Night night.